Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are wading into some pretty murky and honestly pretty terrifying biological waters.
Oh yeah, terrifying is definitely the right word for it.
Right, because we are talking about an organism that can live inside you for years. I mean, literally growing to the length of a school bus without you even knowing it's there.
Which is just a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. Or, in a completely different nightmare scenario, it can actually turn your brain into something resembling Swiss cheese.
Yeah, it's a vivid image, but unfortunately not an exaggeration at all. We are tackling cestodes today, tapeworms. And while the ick factor is obviously off the charts, the biology here is genuinely sophisticated.
Sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't just gross bugs. They are evolutionary masterpieces of survival.
Masterpiece is a strong word for a gut parasite, but I will trust you on that one.
Enough.
So just to set the stage, we are pulling this deep dive primarily from Murray's Medical Microbiology. Specifically, we're looking at Chapter 76 on cestodes.
Correct.
And we've also got some supplementary data from Jowett's to round out the parasitology side of things.
Right.
And our mission today is to do more than just list facts. We want to understand the strategy of these things. Because as I was reading the source material, it really seemed like there are two very distinct lives these organisms lead.
That is the absolute crucial framework. If you want to understand tapeworms, you have to separate them into two buckets.
Okay.
There is the life of the intestinal freeloader, the long worm just living its best life in your gut. And then there is the much more dangerous life of the tissue invader, the time bomb hiding out in your muscles or your liver or your brain.
Right. So we have the freeloader versus the time bomb. And we're going to use that as our map today to help you navigate this topic. But before we get into the specific species, and I know you all want to hear about the brain worms, help us build a physical mental model. When I hear the word tapeworm, I just think of a long, flat white ribbon. Is that basically accurate?
That is the perfect visual anchor, actually. Cestodes belong to the phylum Platyhelminthes, which literally translates to flatworms.
Platyhelminthes, flatworms. Got it.
Exactly. But to really understand how they function, you have to look at their physical equipment. So imagine a long segmented ribbon. At the very front, you have the anchor, which we call the Scolex.
The Scolex, which we usually just call the head, right?
We do, yeah, but I actually want to challenge that terminology a bit.
Oh, why is that?
Well, when we think of a head, we think of a brain, eyes, a mouth, a command center.
Right.
The Scolex isn't that at all. It's purely a mechanical hold-fast organ. Its single solitary job is to grip the wall of your intestine so the worm doesn't get flushed out by your body's natural peristalsis.
Ah, so it's a grappling hook.
It is exactly a grappling hook. And depending on the species you're looking at, this grappling hook might have these really muscular suckers, or it might be crowned with a ring of sharp hooklets that physically dig right into the intestinal mucosa.
That sounds incredibly unpleasant.
It's very effective. But here is the key point. There is no mouth on the Scolex. In fact, there is no mouth anywhere on the entire worm.
See, this is the part that always confuses me.
Ew.
If they don't have a mouth and they don't have a stomach, how on earth do they grow to be 10 meters long?
Yeah.
How do they eat?
Well, they are the ultimate biological minimalists. They have completely outsourced their digestive system to you.
To the host.
Right. They don't need a gut because they live inside yours. They are just bathing in a continuous river of pre-digested nutrients.
Amino acids, glucose, that sort of thing.
Exactly. All the vitamins and nutrients that you have already gone to the trouble of breaking down for them.
So they just sort of soak it up like a sponge.
Through their skin, yes.
Yeah.
We call it the tegument. But it's not just regular skin. If you look at it under an electron microscope, the whole surface is covered in these tiny microscopic hair-like structures called microtriches. Yeah. And they are functionally almost identical to microvilli in your own intestine. They massively increase the surface area so the worm can absorb nutrients with just incredible efficiency.
So in a weird way, they're almost like an inverted intestine, like they're inside out.
That is a brilliant way to put it. They are an inside-out gut floating around inside your gut.
Okay, so we have the grappling hook Scolex at the front, and we have this nutrient-absorbing tegument covering the outside. Now tell me about the ribbon itself, the individual segments.
So those segments are called proglottids, and this is where the whole factory analogy comes in. The tapeworm grows from the neck down. New segments form right behind the Scolex.
Okay.
And as new ones are made, they physically push the older ones further back down the chain.
Like a conveyor belt.
Exactly like a conveyor belt.
Yeah.
And as they move down that conveyor belt, they mature. The young ones near the neck are immature. The ones right in the middle are sexually active.
And these are hermaphrodites, right?
They are. Every single segment has both male and female sets of reproductive organs, which means they can mate with themselves, they can mate with neighboring segments. It's highly efficient.
Wow. And what about the ones at the very end of the line?
By the time a segment reaches the end of the tail, it has completely served its purpose. It's no longer really a living, functioning piece of the creature. It's just a heavily packed bag of eggs.
A bag of eggs.
Yeah, we call these gravid proglottids. And eventually, they just detach from the worm, mix in with your stool, and exit the host to go find the next victim.
It's an incredibly efficient reproductive machine when you think about it. It just anchors in, steals your food, and pumps out egg packets 24/7.
It is evolutionary genius. But, and here's the big but, this whole system only works if the host stays alive. The intestinal adult worm generally does not want to kill you, because if you die, the restaurant closes.
Right. That's the freeloader model. You're losing some nutrients, but you're surviving. But you mentioned a second model earlier, the time bomb.
Yes. This is the fork in the road. And this is honestly what medical students miss all the time when they're studying this. Tapeworm infections present in two completely different ways.
Okay, let's break that down.
Scenario A is the intestinal infection. You have the adult worm. It's gross, it's uncomfortable, but it's usually mild.
That's the freeloader.
Right. Scenario B is the tissue infection. This happens when you are not hosting the adult worm, but you are hosting the larval forms.
The babies.
The babies. And the babies do not want to stay in your gut. They are biologically programmed to migrate. So they actually bore right through your intestinal wall and they travel through your bloodstream to the muscles, the liver, the eyes, or the brain.
And they just stay there.
They form cysts. And that is where you get the really severe, life-threatening pathology.
So broadly speaking, just to summarize for everyone listening, adult worm in the gut equals an uncomfortable but mostly manageable situation. Larvae in the tissues equals a medical emergency.
That is the fundamental rule of cestodes. You have to know which stage of the parasite you're dealing with.
All right, let's apply this framework. We're going to start with the classic textbook pairing, the tale of two meats, the beef tapeworm and the pork tapeworm, Taenia saginata and Taenia solium.
These are the heavy hitters. And when you look at them clinically, this is exactly where that distinction between freeloader and time bomb becomes quite literally a matter of life and death.
Let's start with how you actually get them. I think most people know the basics, don't eat raw meat, but let's actually trace the journey.
The life cycle is a circle. Let's start with the egg. Imagine a cow or a pig is grazing in a field, and it eats some grass that's been contaminated with human feces, and that feces contains tapeworm eggs.
Okay.
Inside the animal, those eggs hatch. But they don't turn into adult worms in the animal's stomach. The larva burrows out of the animal's gut and get into its bloodstream because they're looking for muscle tissue.
They're looking for the meat.
They're looking for the meat, exactly. Once they reach the muscle, they encyst. They form a little fluid-filled bladder, which we call a cysticercosis.
Cysticercosis?
Right. And if you were a butcher and you cut into this infected meat, you would actually see these little white spots throughout the muscle. The old school agricultural term for this is measly meat.
Measly meat. That is a disturbingly quaint term for parasite-infested muscle.
It really is.
So the human comes along, they go to a restaurant and order the steak rare, or maybe some undercooked pork, and we eat that cysticercosis.
And that cysticercosis is tough. It survives your stomach acid. It reaches the small intestine. It senses the bile salts in your gut, and it basically pops open.
Like a trigger.
Exactly. The Scolex comes out, it attaches to the intestinal wall, and it starts the conveyor belt. And in about 3 to 4 months, you have a fully mature adult worm shedding eggs.
Okay, so that is the shared story. Both the beef tapeworm Taenia saginata and the pork tapeworm Taenia solium can do this intestinal routine, but we need to differentiate them. Let's look at the beef tapeworm first. Taenia saginata.
Taenia saginata is strictly the beef tapeworm. And generally speaking, it follows the freeloader model to the letter. It stays in the gut. It almost never causes significant tissue disease in humans.
So what are the symptoms if you have it? Do you even feel a 10-meter worm inside you?
Honestly, often you don't. You might have some vague abdominal pain, maybe some chronic indigestion. Some people report feeling hungry all the time. But saginata does have one physical feature that is particularly well memorable for the patient.
I hesitate to ask. What is it?
The proglottids, those egg packets at the end of the tail we talked about.
Yeah.
In Taenia saginata, they are highly motile. They can actually move on their own.
Oh, no.
Yes. So patients will often report feeling something literally crawling out of them. They might find these white segments moving around in their underwear or in the toilet bowl.
That is horrifying.
It is. And honestly, that psychological trauma is very often the primary complaint that brings them into the clinic.
I can imagine, saying, "Doctor, there's a worm crawling out of me."
Yeah.
That definitely gets you an appointment pretty fast.
Oh, it definitely does. But strictly biologically speaking, saginata is relatively benign. We give you a pill, the worm dies. End of story.
Now we have to pivot to the real villain of the story. The pork tapeworm, Taenia solium.
Yes, this is the one you really need to respect. Taenia solium looks very similar to the beef tapeworm under a microscope, but it has a crucial evolutionary difference in its life cycle capabilities.
Which is?
With the beef tapeworm, humans can only be the definitive host, meaning we only ever carry the adult worm in our gut.
Okay.
But with the pork tapeworm, humans can be the definitive host, or we can accidentally become the intermediate host.
Intermediate host, meaning we are taking the place of the pig.
Precisely. We take the place of the pig, and this right here is the major exam trap that trips up medical students every single year.
Let's make sure they get it then. Break it down.
If you eat undercooked pork that contains the larval cysts, you get the intestinal tapeworm, the freeloader.
Right.
But if you ingest the eggs, the microscopic eggs that are found in human feces, the parasite gets confused. It thinks you are a pig.
So wait, I don't get the tissue disease from eating bad pork chops.
No, you do not. You get the tissue disease from the fecal-oral route.
Wow, okay.
Maybe you have the adult worm yourself and you have poor hand hygiene. That's autoinfection. Or maybe someone else who has the adult worm prepares your food with unwashed hands.
That is a critical distinction. So when you swallow those eggs, what happens?
They hatch right in your stomach. And those larvae think, okay, I'm in a pig, it's time to go find some muscle. So they bore right out of your gut into your bloodstream and they migrate throughout your body.
And in the pig, they usually just go to the muscle. Where do they end up in humans?
They go to the muscles, yes. But unfortunately, they also have a terrifying affinity for the eyes and the central nervous system.
The brain.
The brain. This is the condition called cysticercosis. And when it specifically hits the brain, we call it neurocysticercosis.
I'm actually looking at the MRI image they provided in Murray's Chapter 76 right now, and it is just shocking. It looks like the brain has been used for target practice. There are these dark circular lesions everywhere.
Those are the cysts. And each single one of those holes contains a larval tapeworm. And this brings us to a really critical piece of the pathology, the Swiss cheese brain concept.
Walk us through that.
The brain is enclosed in a rigid skull, right? There's absolutely no room for expansion. So when these cysts form, they take up valuable space. They are classic space-occupying lesions. But the really wild part is that the live parasite isn't actually the main problem.
Wait, the living parasite in your brain isn't the problem. How is that possible?
It's the ultimate paradox of this disease. These live cysts have evolved incredible mechanisms to evade our immune system. They secrete all these molecules that essentially say to your white blood cells, hey, I'm not here, don't look at me, everything is fine.
Like an invisibility cloak.
Exactly, a chemical invisibility cloak.
Yeah.
They can live in your brain tissue for years, causing minimal inflammation. The patient might be walking around totally, completely asymptomatic.
So when does it become a crisis?
The problem starts when the worm dies, whether it dies naturally from old age or because a doctor gave the patient a drug to kill it.
The cloak drops.
The cloak drops. The cyst degenerates. The structural integrity of that cyst wall completely fails, and all those highly antigenic parasite proteins leak out into the brain tissue.
And the immune system suddenly sees it.
Yes.
Yes.
The immune system suddenly wakes up, sees this massive foreign invader that's been hiding there for years, and it launches a huge inflammatory attack.
Oh, wow.
It's this sudden, severe inflammation, the swelling, the edema, that actually causes the clinical symptoms. That's what triggers the seizures, the terrible headaches, the hydrocephalus.
So if a doctor recognizes this and gives a patient antiparasitic drugs, treating them could actually trigger the crisis.
Exactly right. If you just throw a really strong antiparasitic drug at a patient who has a brain full of these cysts, you might kill all the worms at the exact same time.
Which means massive sudden inflammation.
Right. The resulting inflammation can cause acute brain swelling, and the patient can literally die from the treatment.
That is such a high-stakes situation. How do you manage that safely?
You have to put out the fire before you kill the arsonist. The standard medical protocol usually involves starting the patient on high-dose corticosteroids like dexamethasone to deliberately suppress the immune system before and during the antiparasitic treatment.
So you dampen the alarm system so the brain can actually handle the dying cysts without swelling up.
Precisely. It's an incredibly delicate balancing act, and you have to remember neurocysticercosis is a massive global health issue. In endemic areas, so parts of Latin America, Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, it is actually the leading cause of adult-onset epilepsy.
Really?
Yes. If a totally healthy adult suddenly starts having seizures out of nowhere in one of these regions, Taenia solium is the prime suspect until proven otherwise.
That is fascinating. It's not the worm that kills you, it's your own body's reaction to the dead worm.
Exactly.
And just to really hammer this home for the exams, if you're reading a clinical vignette and the question describes a patient with seizures and a brain scan showing cysts, they did not get that from eating undercooked pork yesterday.
Emphatically no. They got it from ingesting human feces containing tapeworm eggs. Eating the pork gives you the gut worm. Eating the eggs gives you the brain cysts. It is the most vital distinction in all of parasitology.
Okay, I think we have thoroughly covered the meats. Let's move over to the water. The fish tapeworm.
Yes.
Diphyllobothrium latum.
Ah, yes. The giant of the deep.
The source material mentions this thing can reach 10 meters, which is over 30 feet long. How does a human being walk around with a 30-foot worm inside them? Where does it fit?
Well, your small intestine is deceptively long. It's about 6 or 7 meters on its own, and it's highly, highly folded. The worm just sort of loops back and forth upon itself inside the lumen. But yes, Diphyllobothrium is massive.
And the vector here is freshwater fish, right?
Yes, but the life cycle is quite a bit more complex than the beef or pork tapeworms. It involves a tiny aquatic crustacean called a copepod.
The copepod.
Right. The copepod eats the larva in the wire. Then a small fish eats the copepod. Then a bigger predatory fish, like a northern pike or a perch or a wild salmon, eats the small fish. And the larvae, which are called plerocercoids, finally end up encysted in the large fish's muscle.
And Murray mentions they look like little grains of rice.
Exactly. They look like little white rice-like bodies embedded right in the fish flesh. So if you eat that raw, think about a freshly caught campfire trout that isn't cooked all the way through, or traditional raw freshwater dishes, you get the worm.
Now, aside from the sheer terrifying size of this thing, Diphyllobothrium has a very specific party trick that makes it an absolute favorite for board exams. It interacts with a specific vitamin.
Yes, the vitamin sponge. Diphyllobothrium latum has this incredible, almost magnetic affinity for vitamin B12. It actively competes with the host for B12 in the intestine.
And I'm assuming it usually wins.
It very often wins. It can actually dissociate the B12 from your intrinsic factor.
Which is the protein our body uses to absorb the vitamin, right?
Exactly. So if the worm burden is high enough, or if the patient's B12 reserves were already a bit borderline to begin with, the worm can completely strip them of this essential nutrient.
Okay, but why does that matter clinically? What actually happens to you when you run out of B12?
B12 is absolutely crucial for DNA synthesis, particularly when your body is making new red blood cells. Without enough B12, your red blood cells can't divide properly during their maturation.
So they just keep growing.
Right, they grow really large, but they fail to divide. This leads to a condition called megaloblastic anemia. You end up with these big, cleansy, ineffective red blood cells that can't carry oxygen well.
Okay, so you're tired and anemic, is that it?
No, it gets worse. B12 is also vital for the maintenance of the myelin sheath. That's the protective insulation wrapped around your nerves.
Oh, so you just start getting nerve damage.
Yes, you get neurological symptoms. Paresthesia, which is that pins and needles numbness and tingling in your fingers and toes. Sometimes patients have trouble walking or maintaining their balance. It perfectly mimics the classic symptoms of pernicious anemia.
So let's synthesize this. If I'm a med student taking an exam and I see a case study that says 40-year-old Scandinavian man loves eating raw pickled fish, complains of profound fatigue and tingling in his toes, and his labs show enlarged red blood cells.
You instantly circled Diphyllobothrium latum, and you confidently move to the next question. That is the classic, undeniable triad. Raw fish, macrocytic anemia, neuropathy.
Got it. Giant worm eats your B12. Let's shrink things down now. We are going from the absolute biggest tapeworm to the smallest ones. The miniature tapeworms, Hymenoleucus and Dipylidium.
Yeah, these two are very often grouped together in clinical practice because they are so commonly seen in pediatric populations.
Let's start with Hymenoleucus nana, the dwarf tapeworm. You say miniature. How small are we talking?
Tiny, usually only about 2 to 4 centimeters long.
Okay, so just a couple inches. But Murray says this is actually the most common tapeworm infection in North America. Why is this little guy so incredibly successful?
It all comes down to speed and simplicity. Think about what we just discussed. Most tapeworms need that complicated intermediate host, the cow, the pig, the specific freshwater fish. They need the cycle to go out into the environment and come back. Hymenoleucus nana is completely unique among human tapeworms. It doesn't actually need an intermediate host.
Wait, So you can just skip the middleman entirely?
Completely. It has a direct life cycle. The eggs are passed in the human stool, and if another human or even the same human ingests those eggs, they are infectious immediately.
So it spreads very easily in places with, let's say, developing hygiene skills, like daycare centers.
Exactly. Toddlers are perfect vectors for this, but the biology actually gets even more insidious than just easy transmission. H. nana is capable of something called internal autoinfection.
Internal autoinfection, how does that work?
Well, usually tapeworm eggs have to physically leave the body into the outside environment to mature or to trigger their next developmental stage. With the dwarf tapeworm, the eggs can hatch right inside the intestine of the exact same host that just produced them.
Wait a second. So if I have one worm and it lays eggs, they hatch inside me, and now I have 10 worms, and then those 10 lay eggs.
Theoretically, yes. The population can exponentially build up without you ever having to eat another speck of contaminated dirt. This mechanism allows the infection to persist for years, and the sheer worm burden can get surprisingly high.
And what does a high burden of tiny worms do to a kid?
It causes a lot of local irritation, chronic diarrhea, vague abdominal pain, restlessness, irritability. It's often misdiagnosed as just standard pediatric tummy troubles until someone checks a stool sample.
The worm that just constantly doubles down on itself. That really is a nightmare for parents. Speaking of parents and kids, let's talk about the other miniature tapeworm, Dipylidium caninum, the dog tapeworm.
This one is a very common and very specific scenario for pediatricians. It usually starts with a highly panicked parent bringing a diaper into the clinic.
And what exactly are they seeing in that diaper?
Pumpkin seeds. Or sometimes people describe them as looking like cucumber seeds. The proglottids of Dipylidium have a very distinct shape. They look like little rice grains or seeds, and they often have a slightly reddish tinge to them. And the kicker is they move actively. Parents find these little segments squirming on the child's stool or disturbingly stuck to the skin right around the anus.
Okay, so we have moving pumpkin seeds in the diaper. But how does a human kid actually get a dog tapeworm? Do they catch it directly from playing with the dog's poop?
No, indirectly. This is a vector-borne transmission, but the vector is honestly pretty odd. The intermediate host here is the flea.
The flea, like a dog flea.
Yes. So here is the chain. The dog has the adult tapeworm in its gut. The dog passes tapeworm eggs in its feces. The flea larvae, which are usually just living in the carpet or in the dog's bedding, eat those microscopic tapeworm eggs. As the flea matures into an adult, the tapeworm develops into a cyst inside the flea's body.
So the flea is the meat in this scenario. It's the cow or the pig.
Exactly right. The flea is the protein snack. So the dog gets an itchy flea bite. It turns around, nibbles at its fur to scratch the itch, and it accidentally swallows the infected flea. The flea is digested, the cyst pops out, and the tapeworm develops in the dog's gut.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for the dog.
Mm.
But for a human child to get it, the child has to accidentally swallow the infected flea.
Yes.
Swallowing a flea, I mean, that seems highly unlikely.
You would think so, but it happens way more than you'd expect. Think about it. Kids play on the floor face down in the carpet. Dogs are constantly licking kids' faces, sometimes right after the dog was just nipping at a flea on its leg. Or the child is exploring and puts their hand in the dog's mouth and then in their own mouth. It literally only takes one flea.
Wow. And how do you treat it?
The human treatment is easy. A dose of praziquantel works like a charm to kill the worm in the child. But the real clinical treatment is for the household. You have to treat the dog, and you absolutely have to control the fleas in the house.
Because if the fleas are still there...
If you don't kill the fleas, the dog just gets reinfected the next day, and the risk to the child remains completely unchanged.
So treat the pet to protect the kid.
Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, we have comprehensively covered the freeloader intestines. Now we really need to swing back to the time bomb category. We talked about cysticercosis earlier, but there's another major tissue invader that is honestly a surgical legend. Hydatid disease, caused by Echinococcus granulosus.
This one is entirely in a league of its own. If Taenia solium is a stealth invader trying to hide from the immune system, Echinococcus is a besieging army digging trenches in your organs.
Who are the main players in this life cycle? Humans are accidental hosts again, right?
Yes, entirely accidental. The natural biological cycle is pastoral. It's rural. The cycle goes back and forth between sheep, which act as the intermediate host, and domestic dogs, or wild canids like wolves, which act as the definitive host.
So how does that work in practice?
The dog eats infected sheep entrails, specifically the liver or lungs of the sheep, which contain the cysts. The dog gets the adult tapeworm in its gut. The dog then sheds tapeworm eggs all over the pasture in its feces. The sheep eat the grass, eat the eggs, and form new cysts. Round and round it goes.
And where does the human step into this circle?
The human is usually a sheep farmer, a shepherd, or just someone living in that specific agricultural environment. They pet the working dog, they get the microscopic eggs on their hands, and then they touch their mouth or eat a sandwich without washing up.
Fecal oral again.
Exactly. Once the human ingests the egg, it hatches in the gut, the larva burrows right through the intestinal wall, and it immediately catches a ride on the portal vein system.
And the portal vein goes straight to the liver.
Right. It's the highway to the liver. And that is exactly where the vast majority of these cysts form, the hydatid cyst. Now, unlike the small pea-sized cysticercosis of the pork tapeworm, the hydatid cyst grows continuously. It can become truly massive. We are talking grapefruit size, even football size, inside the human liver.
A football-sized cyst inside the liver. That is horrifying. But it's not just a balloon full of water. And you described it in our pre-show notes as a Russian doll.
It's a fascinating and deeply terrifying biological structure. The cyst has a thick, tough outer wall, but inside that wall there is a live, active germinal membrane. And this membrane is constantly budding off these little things called brood capsules.
Brood capsules?
Yes. And inside every single one of those capsules are dozens or thousands of protoscoluses, basically microscopic baby tapeworm heads. Sometimes the cyst even forms entire daughter cysts floating around inside the main fluid. So you literally have a bag which is holding smaller bags, which are in turn holding thousands of potential new worms.
Marie mentioned something called hydatid sand. What exactly is that?
If you take that cyst fluid and you let it settle in a test tube, the detached protoscoluses will sink to the very bottom. Under a microscope, it literally looks like granular sand. But every single grain of that sand is a living larval tapeworm head just waiting for an opportunity to grow.
So the sheer size is obviously a danger, right? A football in your liver has to crush the surrounding tissue.
Tissue pressure is definitely a major mechanical problem. It destroys the liver architecture. But the real existential danger, the sword of Damocles hanging over the patient, is the risk of rupture.
Rupture, if the cyst pops.
Right. The fluid inside that hydatid cyst is highly, highly antigenic. To your human immune system, that fluid is essentially toxic nuclear waste.
So if it leaks?
If a farmer gets kicked in the stomach by a horse, or if a surgeon accidentally nicks the cyst wall with a scalpel during removal, all that fluid violently spills out into the open abdominal cavity.
And the immune system just goes crazy.
It causes instantaneous, massive anaphylactic shock. It is a severe, life-threatening allergic reaction, extreme hypotension bronchoconstriction. It can literally kill the patient on the operating table in minutes.
Wow. And what if they survive the shock?
Even if the anesthesiologist manages to save them from the shock, you now have the dissemination problem. Remember the hydatid sand?
Oh, no.
Yeah, that spill just disseminated thousands of live microscopic tapeworm heads throughout the entire peritoneal cavity. Every single one of those heads can now implant on the bowel or the peritoneum and start growing into a brand new cyst. You've essentially turned one massive problem into hundreds of widespread problems.
So it acts almost exactly like a metastatic cancer if you pop it.
It behaves very much like a malignancy in that regard, yes. And that is exactly why the surgical approach to this disease is so incredibly careful. You can't just cut it out. Surgeons use a highly specialized technique called PAIR.
PAIR. P-A-I-R. What does that stand for?
Puncture, aspiration, injection, reaspiration. They carefully stick a needle into the cyst, usually under ultrasound guidance. They suck out a little bit of the fluid just to lower the pressure inside the balloon.
So it doesn't pop.
Exactly. Then they inject a scolicidal agent like pure alcohol or highly hypertonic saline directly into the cyst. The goal is to chemically nuke and kill all the parasites inside. They wait a few minutes for it to work, and then they suck all the dead material back out. You absolutely have to kill the parasite before you even attempt to remove the cyst wall.
That is an incredibly high-stakes procedure. So for the listeners tracking the high-yield points, Echinococcus equals a large liver cyst sheep and dog contact and a massive anaphylaxis risk if manipulated.
That is the perfect clinical triad to remember.
Well, we have definitely covered the lineup of culprits. Now let's talk about the armory. How do we actually fight back? We've mentioned a few specific drugs along the way, but let's systematize the pharmacology for our medical students. What is the silver bullet for cestodes?
The undisputed champion here is praziquantel. It is the frontline drug of choice for almost all adult intestinal tapeworm infections. So Taenia saginata, Taenia solium in the gut, Diphyllobothrium dipylidium. Praziquantel is your go-to.
How does it actually work at a cellular level?
It's a really neat mechanism. It alters the permeability of the tapeworm's cell membrane specifically to calcium ions.
Okay.
It basically throws the calcium channels wide open. A massive flood of calcium rushes into the worm cells, which triggers an intense, unstoppable tetanic muscle contraction.
So the worm just seizes up.
Basically, yes, the entire worm gets a full body cramp that it physically cannot release. Because it's paralyzed, it loses its mechanical grip on your intestinal mucosa, and it just gets harmlessly flushed out with your normal bowel movements.
Simple, elegant, and effective. But what about the cysts? The tissue forms hiding out in the brain or the liver?
That's where praziquantel struggles. It doesn't penetrate those thick cyst walls very effectively. So for the tissue infections like cysticercosis and hydatid disease, we generally rely on albendazole.
And how is albendazole different?
Albendazole works on a totally different pathway. It binds to tubulin and actively inhibits microtubule synthesis in the parasite.
Microtubules. Those are structural, right?
Structural, yes, but they are also essential for cellular transport. By destroying the microtubules, albendazole essentially stops the worm cells from being able to absorb glucose. It very slowly and systematically starves the parasite to death.
So praziquantel is the fast paralyzer and albendazole is the slow starver.
Generally speaking, yes, bendazole is much better for tissue penetration, but as we discussed at length with neurocysticercosis, you have to be extremely careful managing the inflammatory response that happens when you slowly starve those brain cysts to death.
Right. Don't forget the steroids.
Never forget the steroids.
And what about prevention? After hearing all this, it feels like we just need to cook our food a little better. Is it that simple?
It really is that simple in theory, but obviously it's very hard to implement perfectly on a global scale. There are basically 4 pillars of prevention. Number 1 is cook your meat thoroughly. That kills the cysticerces in beef and pork.
Simple enough.
Number 2 is freeze your fish. Industrial freezing reliably kills Diphyllobothrium pleurocercoides. That is actually why the term sushi-grade fish exists. It legally implies the fish has been deep frozen to specific USDA guidelines to kill parasites before it's served raw.
I didn't know that. That's reassuring.
Number 3 is basic human hygiene. Vigorous hand washing is literally the only way to stop the fecal-oral spread of Taenia, solium eggs, and Echinococcus.
Wash your hands after petting the farm dog.
Exactly. And finally, number 4 is flea control. Keep your domestic pets on preventative flea medications to completely break the transmission chain for Dipillidium.
It's all very basic public health stuff, but the consequences of ignoring it are pretty severe. I mean, we are talking about Swiss cheese brains and football-sized liver cysts.
Very high stakes for very simple mistakes.
Absolutely. All right, well, we have unpacked the biology, the horrors, and the cures. Now I want to see if our listeners were actively paying attention. It's time for the rapid recall.
Let's do it.
I'm going to give you a quick clinical scenario, a single best answer style question, exactly like you'd see on the boards. I will pause for just a second to let you think, and then our expert will break down the answer and, more importantly, explain the why behind it. Are you ready? Let's go. Question 1.
I'm ready.
You are on rotation in the neurology ward. A patient presents with new onset seizures. An MRI shows multiple calcified and non-calcified cystic lesions scattered throughout the brain parenchyma. Upon taking a dietary history, the patient admits to eating rare steak and undercooked pork chops on a regular basis. Here is the question. What specific stage of the parasite caused the brain lesions? Was it the larva in the meat or was it the egg? Take a second.
The correct answer here is the egg. This is arguably the #1 concept to master in this entire chapter. Eating undercooked meat, which contains the larvae, gives you the intestinal tapeworm. It does not cause brain cysts directly. To get neurocysticercosis, the patient absolutely had to ingest Taenia solium eggs via fecal-oral contamination. Now it's possible the patient's diet of undercooked pork gave them the intestinal worm first, which then led to autoinfection with their own eggs, but the direct biological cause of the brain cysts is always the egg.
Excellent. Question 2. A 45-year-old man presents with severe fatigue, pallor, and a tingling numbness in his hands and feet. A peripheral blood smear shows macrocytosis, which is enlarged red blood cells. His social history reveals he makes his own traditional freshwater gefilte fish, and he often tastes the raw mix for seasoning before cooking it. What is the precise mechanism of his anemia? Take a second.
The mechanism is profound. Vitamin B12 depletion. The organism in this scenario is Diphyllobothrium laudum, the broadfish tapeworm. The worm actively dissociates B12 from the host's intrinsic factor and absorbs it for itself. This resulting B12 deficiency directly leads to the megaloblastic anemia and the peripheral neuropathy. The massive clinical clues here are freshwater fish and macrocytosis.
Spot on. Question 3. A frantic parent brings a clear plastic container to the pediatric clinic. Inside the container are small white moving segments that look exactly like pumpkin seeds. The child has no systemic symptoms, but the family does own a dog. What is the most likely route of transmission for this specific infection in the child? Take a second.
The route is ingestion of an infected flea. The organism here is Dipylidium caninum. The pumpkin seed segments are the diagnostic giveaway. You have to remember the transmission chain. Dog has the worm flea, eats the egg, child accidentally eats the flea. The child did not get this from directly eating dog feces. The flea is a mandatory intermediate host in this cycle.
Perfect. Question 4. Which intestinal cestode is capable of internal autoinfection, allowing the worm population to rapidly increase within the host without any re-exposure from the outside environment? Take a second.
That would be Hymenopus nana, the dwarf tapeworm. While Taenia solium can cause autoinfection that leads to tissue cysticercosis, Hymenopus nana eggs can hatch directly in the gut and develop into brand new adult worms immediately. This internal reinfection cycle continuously increases the intestinal worm burden and is entirely unique to the dwarf tapeworm.
And the final question, number 5. A sheep farmer in rural New Zealand presents with a heavy right upper quadrant pain. An ultrasound reveals a large, complex septated cyst in the right lobe of the liver. The attending surgeon explicitly warns the junior resident not to perform a routine needle aspiration for a biopsy. Why is needle aspiration strictly contraindicated in this patient? Take a second.
It is contraindicated due to the extreme risk of anaphylactic shock and peritoneal dissemination. The organism is Echinococcus granulosus, which causes the hydatid cyst. If you poke that cyst and the fluid leaks, it can instantly trigger a fatal Ig-mediated allergic reaction. Furthermore, any spilled fluid will spread live protoscolices, the hydatid SAM, throughout the abdomen, seeding dozens of secondary cysts.
All right, how'd you do out there? If you nailed the egg versus larva distinction back in question 1, you are already way ahead of the curve. That is the highest yield point in this entire textbook chapter.
Definitely. And hey, if you missed the flea question, don't beat yourself up. Just remember, from now on, fleas are the forbidden snack.
Gross but accurate. As we wrap up this deep dive, I actually want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've spent a lot of time today focusing on the horror of the time bomb infections. But if you look closely at the freeloaders, the intestinal worms, there's a really weird kind of evolutionary truce happening there.
Truce is an interesting word for it.
Well, the source material lightly touches on this, but modern parasitology suggests that in some populations, these intestinal worms actively regulate and calm down the human immune system. They actively dampen systemic inflammation. There's even this growing field around the hygiene hypothesis that suggests our modern lack of these parasites might actually be a major reason why we have such sky-high rates of autoimmune diseases and severe allergies today.
It is actually very true. From a biological perspective, the worm desperately wants you to tolerate its presence, so it constantly sends out chemical signals to calm your immune system down. When we artificially remove the worm with modern medicine, sometimes the immune system essentially gets bored, lacks a target, and starts attacking the host's own tissues, which is how you end up with severe allergies or inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's.
So it's obviously not a medical recommendation to go eat raw pork, but it really highlights that our relationship with these organisms is ancient and incredibly complex. We aren't just host and invader. We are biological partners who've been at war and occasionally at a weird kind of peace for literally millions of years.
It is a very complicated relationship indeed.
It is. But I think if push comes to shove, I will still gladly take the praziquantel.
Oh yeah, me too. Without hesitation.
Well, that is it for this deep dive into Cestodes. Check your meat, wash your hands, and we will see you next time.
Stay curious, everyone.